Hey guys, so I hope that you can kind of see this stuff okay. I've been trying to play with the lighting and everything and bring my computer in from home to kind of shoot this. But I'm going to do a quick little introduction to ASV, talk a little bit about how ASV is working, what exactly it is, and then how to kind of make some basic changes in ASV, as well as how to kind of know what you're doing in regards to ventilator weaning here. So, first and foremost, on the Hamilton ventilators, and I got it on the big screen too, so I don't know which one you can kind of see a little bit better here. So with the Hamilton vents, it is essential if you're going to run ASV that you have the proper patient demographics in. So having the correct height and sex or gender, so we can have an appropriate ideal body weight, because the ventilator is actually going to use that just how you use it when you're coming up with ventilator settings and such. All right. So I got that addressed right here on our home screen or start screen and everything like that. If you're running this on a patient, you should also confirm that by going and looking at the patient information. So I'm going to go ahead and just to kind of show you again, remember on the Hamilton ventilators, it kind of segregates all your modes. So you got all of your, kind of true pressure type ventilation and stuff on the left-hand side of the mode screens and everything like that. On the upper right, you have, your volume, traditional volume type ventilation. And then you have your volume targeted pressure type stuff. And ASV is really kind of using that format. So your PRVC and something called volume supported, we'll talk about a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead and choose ASV. I'm going to hit continue. So when you look at the things that pop up, when you think about usually coming up with ventilator settings for, a regular patient in a traditional form of ventilation, you're having to think about respiratory rate. You're having to think about tidal volume. You're trying to come up with an appropriate minute ventilation for that patient. You're having to set a flow rate or an I time to make sure you have an appropriate, time for exhalation, I time conducive with, effective gas exchange. There's a lot of different variables to set, and we have to be proficient at knowing a little bit about that patient's problems, at least, if we don't know it before starting ventilation, at least being able to look at the readouts and graphics and kind of see what that patient's problem is. And we got to make adjustments based upon their compliance and resistance and these time constant things that we talked about in class. So with ASV, if you look, we don't really have that abundance of things to choose from. So in ASV, the ventilator is ultimately choosing the tidal volume and the respiratory rate that it sees as sufficient and appropriate for that patient to not only maintain lung protective ventilation, but it looks at that patient's compliance and resistance and time constants and comes up with what it considers an optimal combination of those variables to really achieve a certain minute ventilation. So what we do set is percent minute ventilation here. So you can see that here. You can see that up here. So percent minute volume. 100% minute volume is based upon the same concepts we learn in regards to initiation of ventilation. All right. It is based upon the idea that most patients on a ventilator are going to need about 100 mils per kilo per minute of ideal body weight in order to achieve a normal PaCO2. So if you were to, if we'll fire this up here in a little bit, but if you look up here at this little screen, it shows you this patient is getting 7.1 liters per minute of minute volume. If I choose this at 100% as my target, because their ideal body weight is 71 kilograms. So I'm choosing percent minute volume instead of tidal volume and respiratory rate. So I do the same type things. If it was just a post-op patient, I could put them on 100% minute volume and it's probably going to be sufficient. All right. If I had somebody with tremendous fever and respiratory distress, I could figure out how much more than that initial baseline minute ventilation I wanted to give, and I just adjust the minute ventilation right here. All right. Once again, the ventilator is going to choose the optimal way to achieve that, and it's going to be able to change as the patient's lungs maybe change. So we also still set PEEP and FiO2, so we still have to independently manage oxygenation and everything for this patient. All right. If you look over here, we have some things that look familiar still. So we'll talk about why these things are present, but obviously we always want our patient to be able to trigger. So we got our flow trigger. All right. We got our pressure limit in regards for ASV. So it's pretty much setting the cap on how high it's going to be able to, or it's really setting the constraints in which the ventilator has to operate within. Okay. So we're setting that at 30 here. We have, oh, hang on, I backed out here. We have expiratory trigger sensitivity or flow cycle percentage is what we'll kind of refer to it as. So that's going to be for spontaneous breaths, and we'll talk about why exactly or how these breaths are going to manifest. And then we got rise time. Okay, so rise time would be for the patient's spontaneous breaths as well as, I guess, the patient's mandatory breaths as well. So, what is ASV? ASV is IMV, pressure IMV. All right, so really volume targeted pressure IMV. So, what does that mean? So, when the patient is not actively breathing, all right, they are going to get PRVC breath. So it's going to target a volume, all right, but it's going to give those as a pressure breath, all right. Um, so when you think about it, nothing changes in regards to what you already know about PRVC. It's going to give those targeted tidal volume breaths as pressure, okay. So if that patient is not breathing, it's going to give those breaths at a certain size and a certain rate. It's going to dictate the I time based upon, looking at that patient's time constants and making sure it gives enough time for exhalation and everything. And pretty much it's going to achieve the minute ventilation like that. So what is different with this is as a patient starts to actively breathe, they actually cannot trigger a true mandatory breath. All right, so the mandatory breaths only really take place if that patient is not breathing or not achieving their minute ventilation. As the patient actively breathes and initiates their own breaths, they're able to get spontaneous breaths, but they're given in the form of volume support. So volume support, I'll cover that in another video, but volume support is pretty much PRVC for the spontaneous breathing patient. So it's adjustable pressure support if you think about it like that. We pick a targeted tidal volume and it's going to adjust to make sure it's delivering that tidal volume up or down as the things, as the patient's demand changes, as the patient's lung characteristics change, and so on. All right. So a patient can actively breathe comfortably and get spontaneous breaths. All right. The only time the mandatory breaths kick in is if that patient is not achieving their targeted minute ventilation or if they're not breathing at all or anything like that. Okay. So this is IMV. So what we're going to do here, I'm going to go ahead and go to confirm. I'm going to go ahead and start ventilation. So it's going to take just a second here. We'll let everything begin to kind of register and whatnot. All right. And then I'll show you a couple of things that I kind of change here. So if I'm running ASV, what I like is to originally look at the ASV monitor, okay? We'll talk about the vent status graph and everything. This can be useful as we approach weaning and everything, but I also like to look at the ASV graph. So if you look, just to kind of prove my points here, if you look at your pressure waveform, it's square, so we know that this is a pressure delivered breath, okay? So why is this important? So I like to access these just to kind of show you, all right? And it looks like I got maybe a little leak on my flow, flow trigger here. Hang on a second. Or my flow sensor, I mean. So what I like to do is take a look at this because it shows us what we're targeting. So the ventilator's looking at this patient's compliance and resistance, okay? It's targeting a minute volume of 7.1. It's chosen based upon this patient's lung characteristics to deliver a tidal volume of about 334 milliliters at this particular respiratory rate, okay? You can see it's using a very, very long I time and much longer than what we would probably set, 1.41 seconds. However, keep in mind, these are for these mandatory breaths here. If the patient begins to breathe spontaneous, they'll get these flow cycle breaths, so it'll be more conducive for what that patient wants. All right. So I like to be able to see what the ventilator's targeting as well as what we're currently delivering. If you look over here on the ASV graph, it shows us where we're at. So that's the current. So to be like a crosshair, okay? And it shows us what our target is. So you can see that the crosshairs are in the target right now. This red box signifies the parameters in which this ventilator can change either respiratory rate and or tidal volume in order to get that particular minute ventilation. Okay, so it's looking at lung compliance and resistance and calculating time constants and all this stuff to come up with its settings. So you can see we're achieving our patient's minute ventilation that we were targeting initially that we said. It's just choosing how to do that. And you can see that it's kind of on the lower end of the tidal volume and everything like that. If we go to monitoring, you can see it's given just a little bit less than 5 mils per kilo of ideal body weight. All right, it's because I got my lung set pretty stiff here and everything like that. So let's take a look and see what happens. So let's look at the target parameters here and let's look at my ASV graph as I make a change to my patient's lung characteristics. So I just removed a spring and made my lung very, very compliant. you can see once again, since these are PRVC breaths, it was delivering those breaths at a previous pressure and everything like that. So my tidal volumes quickly went up, and my minute ventilation went up. So it's going to take the ventilator a minute to kind of change here. That was a pretty sudden change in compliance, much more so than what would happen on a patient. But you can see now my target parameters are changing. The shape of my box that defines what options for respiratory rate and tidal volume can be chosen has changed. And you can see my target, my current values are a little bit off. So the ventilator's having to make some adjustments here. So you can see now that my compliance is improved, it's actually gone up on my tidal volume just a little bit, all right, on my target, and it's gone down on my respiratory rate. It's still targeting the same minute ventilation. So this ventilator is simply doing what we would do at the bedside, but it does it very rapidly, and it could do it on a breath by breath basis and everything like that. So you can see it. Sorry, you can see how things kind of quickly change. Let's say I get a blood gas from my patient, and this patient is still not making any efforts, and they are acidotic. All right. Instead of choosing to go up on tidal volume or respiratory rate, all I have to simply do is go up on my minute ventilation. It's not a bad idea. I like to go from the controls tab so I can see exactly what my minute volume is. You can use this percentage just as you would any other variable when doing your calculations, or if you wanted to just stick with the minute ventilation calculations I've showed you before, you could do so and just adjust until you get the minute volume you think that patient needs. Okay. So I'm going to go up, and let's say we get a blood gas, and now I'm up to 150%. All right, I'm going to target a minute ventilation at 10.7. So you'll see ventilator is changing the way that it's going to try and deliver this minute ventilation. It's going up on my tidal volume as well up on the respiratory rate. If you notice, we were given really long I times before. With this increased ventilatory demand placed on the ventilator, it's having to adjust its I time to make sure we don't have autoPEEP. And if you look at this patient's flow waveform here, you can see we're coming back to baseline just in time. So it actually adjusts settings so there's no autoPEEP problems or anything like that. And you can see my box kind of changed a little bit. All right. So it shows you how much inspiratory pressure I'm actually having to give, on top of PEEP in order to kind of achieve my current settings and stuff. But once again, this thing, all we do is change to the target minute ventilation, and it goes from there, and it's going to pick the best combination in order to do so, and it can change kind of rapidly. If all of it, so you can see right now, getting a rate of 23, about 465. Current minute ventilation or current target tidal volume is about 6.6 mils per kilo. All right. Let me change my compliance again. Hang on, I lost the screen. Actually, let's change my resistance. I'm going to change my level of airways resistance, hopefully not too extreme. All right, and you'll see the ventilator is going to take a second, and it's going to change things up. So what it's trying to do, it's figuring out this time constant. It's evaluating my patient's lung characteristics. All right. And look what happened. My box kind of shrunk in regards to how it is able to kind of move and choose my kind of target parameters. You can see I'm getting close to my ASV pressure limit. So in this case, because of this high level of resistance, it's running into problems with escalating. I may not be able to achieve my minute ventilation if I do not adjust my pressure limit. All right. Typically, since we're delivering volume targeted pressure ventilation in this, I would be leery about going any higher than 30. But if we look at my particular patient's flow waveform, that breath cycles off far before it gets to the point of reaching zero flow. So we know there isn't total equilibration between my Y and my lung. So I could go up on this a little bit with some caution here. Ooh, hang on. I'm going to go up just a smidge. Okay. I'm also going to go up on my regular pressure limit. You still set a regular high pressure limit different. If the patient coughs or anything like that. The ASV limit really is just what dictates the titration range for the ventilator. So what's interesting is, look what it did. So instead of choosing the small tidal volumes, it chooses to give a little bit higher tidal volumes here, a little bit higher than what I would like. And this may not be on the correct, I think there's a newer software variation that maybe targets kind of some lower settings and stuff like that, more lung protective. But you can see in order to achieve that particular patient's minute ventilation, it's going and giving me a high tidal volume with a lower rate, and we're still not having any autoPEEP or anything like that. If I didn't want to allow it to go that high, go back to 30. All right, and it's going to have to figure out a new way. There's times where it may not be able to achieve that particular patient's minute ventilation. All right, and we'll kind of talk about how to kind of navigate about that here in just a little bit. So let me give this thing a second. You can see, so it's ever changing. It's tiled back down our settings here and everything like that. And it's chosen a safer way to give my patient their minute ventilation. So I'm a little bit closer, more to appropriate 8 mils per kilo. Still not happy about the 8.5. All right. And you can see we're slowly changing our current to get close to our target and everything like that. So you can see we're further kind of down regulating everything. All right. And then if all of a sudden my resistance changed again and I go, oh man, I got my patient cleared out. What I don't like about, PRVC is with this rapid change, you can see it's given that previous pressure and my tidal volume is really high. It's going to take a second for everything to kind of back down. And you can see my target is way down here. It's going to take me a second. And it's slowly getting back down to more of an appropriate value here. Okay. So what can be, and we'll talk about what happens as the patient starts kind of actively breathing here once things kind of normalize out a little bit. I'm going to change my compliance up a little bit more now that my resistance is kind of normalized. So ventilator's going to think for a second. You'll see it's going to change its target. It's going to go to, now that my lung's a little more stiff, it's going to drop that volume target, and it's going to go up on my respiratory rate in order to achieve that minute ventilation. Right? And you can see my box kind of changed here. Okay. So let's take a look and see what happens as this patient starts kind of actively breathing. So you can see these breaths are triggered. All right, we see the little purple icon here. Just to show you, if I wanted a longer breath, all right, just proving that it's flow cycled. So it's targeting that same volume, but it's doing it so in a volume support type format. Okay, so it's pressure support breath, but it's adjusting to get an appropriate tidal volume. So if my effort kind of changes, if my lung characteristics change, it's still going to ramp up the amount of help it's giving me for my particular patient in order to achieve that kind of target tidal volume. If I stop breathing, it realizes that my minute ventilation is going to drop, and it's going to kick back in and give those mandatory breaths here again. All right, so let me fix my compliance again. So if I had a patient, what I'm gonna do now, I'm gonna have this patient actively breathing. I'm gonna switch back over to the vent status tab. I'm gonna wean down my FiO2. We'll say this patient's doing really well. So what I'm trying to show you here is, say my patient is getting better and I want them to do more of their own breathing. I'm trying to make some weaning efforts. They're breathing more spontaneously. As I decrease the amount of help they're getting from the ventilator, all right, so now I'm just targeting a minute ventilation at 3.6. My patient's able to achieve that. I can allow them to breathe more spontaneously and not have those mandatory breaths kind of kick in. So if you have this vent status on, as we start backing off and we allow that patient to breathe more spontaneously, all right, you'll see all these little icons that kind of fall into place. I got to breathe a little bit slower here. As that patient's situation kind of improves and everything falls into place, we can kind of look at these little tabs over here. And when it falls into everything being appropriate for that patient, considering their ability to be maybe evaluated for liberation, it starts a timer. What we do in ASV is, if my patient is reaching their target minute ventilation, They're breathing a primary or a good majority of their breaths. In this case, 100% are spontaneous. Their minute ventilation isn't too high. RSBI looks good. FiO2 and PEEP are within acceptable parameters. And it's not taking a lot of airway pressure in order to achieve these target tidal volumes. Remember, this is really like PRVC for spontaneous breathing or volume support. So if they're achieving their tidal volumes without getting a lot of support, it's letting us know that they're ready to probably be considered weaning. Would you be worried about a patient who's getting pressure support of 5 and PEEP of 5? No, they're on a spontaneous breathing trial without us even having to set it. So you could actually extubate somebody from these lower settings, 40% minute ventilation. You can go even a little bit lower if you really wanted to, or you could choose to switch them over to a spontaneous breathing trial. But if you get this little green, I'm start talking and I'm not breathing right for this thing, and I drop back out of my parameters, it'll let you know how long that patient has been a candidate for evaluation of ventilator liberation and stuff like that. All right. So that's kind of how we can wean in ASV as the patient's situation improves or they're breathing more and more on their own. As we back off on that percentage of minute ventilation and allow that patient to breathe more spontaneously, they don't have those mandatory breaths to fall back upon. So kind of similar to using IMV or SIMV and everything like that, just kind of in a different context. The mandatory breaths only come in and play a part when that patient is actually not reaching that minute ventilation, opposed to SIMV where they have to get that defined minimum amount and maximum amount of mandatory breaths every minute. In ASV, they may never get any mandatory breaths depending on that patient's respiratory drive and abilities and everything like that. So you can see right now, oh, hang on. I got my lungs set super compliant. It's not really exhaling. So you can see we're targeting a different minute ventilation here now. It's taking a second to kind of pick back up. All right, but it's going to go ahead and start adjusting all my settings here and everything. My lung was breathing so compliant before. You can see it's taken a little bit with me pulling. It was really, really compliant. So it's targeting this stuff, but we're way low since it's volume targeted pressure ventilation. So it's going to take a second here. In reality, these changes wouldn't happen so drastic on a real breathing patient. Hopefully, that's just me making a lot of adjustments back over here and everything like that. All right. So you can see it's slowly escalating stuff. We're getting all mandatory breaths here now. And we would kind of continue to either consider if this patient needs to stay on ASV or if we're ready to kind of wean this patient. In this patient's case, I got it back on 100% minute ventilation, and it's all mandatory breaths because I stopped squeezing it so I could finish kind of talking to you here and everything like that. So one other thing you can consider in ASV, if you guys are running it, if you go to this graph, say you have a patient who's breathing really hard spontaneously and you don't know what to do, all right? If you see that patient's, so if I had this patient set at 100% minute ventilation, for instance, you come in and they're struggling, they're working hard to breathe, all right? If your patient's target's back here and their current is way higher, all right, we can try and adjust that percentage minute ventilation. So go up and up and up to try and give more mandatory support for that patient. It's going to try and target a larger tidal volume in many instances or more mandatory breaths. So we can try and shuffle some of that workload off the patient back onto the ventilator and everything. So if you see your current being way far off from your target, and your patient is struggling, you want to try and give them more support, the only way to do that in this particular mode of ventilation would be to go up on your percentage minute ventilation, everything like that. You can also, since they're getting spontaneous breaths, you can still do all the same stuff that we would do in pressure support, target a rise time, adjust your flow cycle percentage, and so on and everything like that. But if you want your patient to get more mandatory breaths from the ventilator, and you want them to maybe not have to have that drive to breathe so hard spontaneously, we could try and increase that percentage minute ventilation up as high as we needed to kind of let them kind of rest and let the ventilator do most of the work. As you see, this does go up to 350% minute ventilation. All right. What you'll come into problems, there's times where it cannot reach target. So like I'll go ahead and I'll go up on my percentage minute ventilation here to 350 just to show you my minute ventilation is now 25 liters a minute. My target is. So what you're going to see happen is it's not going to be able to reach this. And I'll just kind of show you in that to kind of conclude our ASV video. It's already telling us check high pressure limit. It cannot get us where we need to go. All right. Let me make some adjustments here. It's going to try and get me pretty close. okay, but it's going to say ASV cannot meet target. So in those cases, you have to realize, and this is way faster than what I'd ever set on a respiratory rate, okay, you have to realize, okay, I can't reach this, and then you'd have to consider permissive hypercapnia and backing off and everything like that, or changing your ASV target. I mean, changing your ASV pressure limit and stuff like that. You have to evaluate: do you want to allow the ventilator to have more range on pressure to go up or whatnot? Okay, so in these cases, I would back off to a more reasonable target where it's able to kind of achieve it and everything like that. All right. So, lastly, let me tell you my parting words about ASV. So, you could consider this, I guess, a form of automated ventilation, or IntelliVent, or in artificial intelligence, whatever. What I'll tell you about it is artificial intelligence is great when you're in situations where there's a lack of intelligence to begin with. Okay, so I'm not knocking ASV. It's very useful. Certain patients, it's great. It's more automated. Lets the ventilator make more rapid adjustments than what we would typically be able to make in a shift. However, when things really go by the wayside, or in patients having trouble, or if you're at a facility that doesn't have ASV, you can do the exact same things this ventilator can do for the most part. All right, and adjust your settings based upon what's going on with them. It just takes a solid understanding of what we're doing in order to accomplish that type of stuff. Okay, so don't feel like ASV is the end all cure all or anything like that. Is it very useful? Most definitely. It can make changes more rapidly than we would have time for. But when push comes to shove, we still need to know how to manage our patient's ventilator in traditional forms of, CMV, IMV, stuff like that. And we'll leave it at that here for now. If you guys got any questions, make sure you reach out. I know this is kind of short and sweet and everything like that, but hopefully that helps.